In the story of the giving of the Torah, we're told that Moshe writes Sefer HaBris, a book of a covenant that he then presents and reads to the Jewish people. The question is, what is in that book of the covenant? And when Rashi describes it to us, it immediately raises our eyebrows, because what Rashi is saying doesn't seem to be obvious from the text, and yet carries a really important insight into when this happened, what its message is, and what the difference is between the covenant we had with Hashem before the giving of the Torah versus after the giving of the Torah. Even pasuk called of the Sefer Parasha, commenting on the pasuk towards the end of our parasha, which says, "Vayichtav Moshe has called divrei Hashem," that Moshe wrote down all of the words of Hashem, very broad expression. So Rashi takes out those two words. Moshe wrote on his Mefarish, explains that what did he write? Mi Bereshis vad matan Torah, everything that is recorded in the Torah from Bereshis until that point. And additionally, Kosab, he also wrote mitzvah shenitztava b'morah, the mitzvahs that had recently been given at Morah, Shabbos, etc. As discussed numerous times, is Rashi b'Furush HaTorah Mefarish Pshuto Shel Mikra. We know that Rashi's goal in his commentary is to give us the simplest understanding of the pasuk or the psukim. Davon verstehen, in which case we have to understand. Vos is the hechech in Pshuto Shel Mikra. What about the simple understanding of this pasuk forces us to conclude, as Moshe had geschrieben alle inyonim mi Bereshis vad matan Torah, that Moshe wrote everything from Bereshis until now? Where in the context do we see anything that lends itself to that message? Especially when you consider the pasuk is saying that Moshe wrote the words of Hashem. Most of Bereshis is told in story fashion, and so is the beginning of Shmos. And how also do we know from the context of the Pshat that the mitzvahs he recorded were the mitzvahs given at Morah, and not maybe pieces of the stories of Bereshis, or other things that Hashem said? Where do we know clearly from this series of psukim that this is what Moshe wrote in that sefer? Nochmer, let's take it a step further. Because in Pasuk Noshtet, listen to the words of the Pasuk. It says, Vayichtav Moshe is called divrei Hashem. That Moshe gave all of the words of Hashem. Now, there zel beloshen, that exact expression is used one Pasuk earlier. Vashtet na friedige Pasuk. Vayover Moshe, the Pasuk there says Moshe came, Vayisapel Amen, he told the people, as called divrei Hashem, all the words of Hashem, and nobody suggests that at that point Moshe Rabbeinu came and told them the whole story from Bereshis until where they were, plus mitzvahs. There, instead, was Rashi Taichtot, as called divrei Hashem. There, Rashi explains that what are all the words that are of Hashem that Moshe conveyed to the Jewish people, things that were relevant right there and then. Mitzvahs Prisha, the mitzvah for them to separate from their spouses, Ve'hagbala, and to put a boundary around, to cordon off Har Sinai. Tavos is the Tam Leshanas Dem Pirush from Vayichtav Moshe as called divrei Hashem in them pasuk. So how come one pasuk later does Rashi change the interpretation of writing called divrei Hashem from the Pirush Friedige pasuk from what he said in the preceding pasuk? Now, our film is all learning. So you might say, okay, the reason is because the way we're learning is as mitzvahs prisha v'hagbala is given an ein moleki inyan al sachona to matan Torah. Needless to say, the mitzvahs of how couples had to behave and how they had to cordon off Har Sinai was a once-off mitzvah that only applied at that particular point in time. Is defined mistavra as norif dem basitzach devayichtav Moshe. So it would be a little far-fetched to say, and Moshe wrote it down into a book, because usually you write something for posterity. If Moshe is writing something, that implies it has relevance later, and of course the rules around Har Sinai don't have relevance later. They only have relevance in this particular moment. Or you can even say it further. When you write something down, it's not only relevant for later, but it's relevant for generations. So ken men doch lernen as the Vayichtav Moshe is kedel zusammen mit mitzvahs prisha v'hagbala. So maybe that's what lends us to believe that the writing over here is not just writing down instructions that were relevant to prepare for getting the Torah, but you could expect that Moshe was recording other conversations that were relevant in the run-up to the receiving of the Torah, which are things that were told at that particular point in time, but would also have a relevance later. And you have a clear example of this in Rabbeinu Bechai's interpretation, where he says, as Vayichtav Moshe is called divrei Hashem meant, that this pasuk where Moshe wrote down all of the words of Hashem actually implies hatunoyim, that there were certain conditions Moshe proposed to the Jewish people at that time that have relevance across history. That if you listen to my voice, then you'll be my special nation. And likewise, if you fulfill my covenant. So maybe that's actually what's going on over here. Vayichtav Moshe, he didn't only write down Prisha Hagbala, he wrote other things as well that would be relevant in the future. Our question is, what in Rashi's commentary what in the Psukim supports Rashi's commentary that that's not what was written, but instead it was the whole story of Bereshis until this point and selected mitzvahs, the mitzvahs of Morah. Now, di Tmiyah is noch gresser. This question on Rashi is actually sharper when you start to look at where Rashi presumably based his commentary on, because Rashi doesn't invent things, they're all from earlier sources. So, we're going to find something very similar to what Rashi says in the Mechilta, very similar, but actually altogether differently, because Rashi's Meshana fun Mechilta, the way that Rashi presents his commentary, is completely different to the Mechilta in such a way, boifen, as the appears from Rashi is Deloy Kaman, that the three opinions brought in the Mechilta, none of them are what Rashi is saying. So the Mechilta bringt drei deis. The Mechilta presents three possible opinions of what was written in this book that Moshe Rabbeinu produced. Rabbi Yosef Rabbi Asi mitchilas Bereshis vadkan. So the first opinion, which sounds similar to Rashi, says the whole story from Bereshis until here, but doesn't say anything about the mitzvahs. Then Rabbi Omer, something that also sounds similar, mitzvah shenitztav Adam Rishon, the mitzvahs given to Adam Rishon, which is the first 6 human universal mitzvahs, and a mitzvah shenitztav b'nei Noach, then the mitzvahs that were given specifically to Noach, so the Sheva mitzvahs b'nei Noach, or mitzvah shenitztav b'mitzrayim, and the mitzvahs the Jews were given while still in Egypt, like Rosh Chodesh and Korban Pesach and Tefillin, over Morah, and the mitzvahs that were given in Morah, like Shabbos, or Shar Kol mitzvahs Kulam, and other mitzvahs as well. So that sounds a little similar to what Rashi said, except none of the story of Bereshis. And then Rabbi Shmuel says something which is completely different to anything Rashi had suggested. Later on, what does the Torah tell us was given to the Jewish people Har Sinai when they got to Har Sinai was that you work your field for 6 years and then you leave it fallow in the 7th year, which is Shmitim v'Yovelos, the cycle, the agricultural halakhic cycle, where you break in a Shemitah year and you break in a Yovel year. Brachos Klolos, as well as the Brachos and Klolos, said if we listen to what Hashem says. And then what is the last part of this conversation that was presented to the Jewish people, as recorded in Parashas Bechukosai, is these are the laws that Moshe shared with the Jewish people. To which the Jewish people said, we accept them. So there's 3 views, none of which seems to fit with Rashi. Rashi's the Eshta Tzvei Deos zusammen. Rashi's view is essentially a mix of Rabbi Yosef Rabbi and the Rabbi together into one opinion, as if they were one opinion, because he says Beresh is still here plus mitzvahs of Morah. Now, maybe you'll say, hang on a second, Rashi's not seeing a debate between the 2 first opinions. He's actually seeing them as a continuum. As Rabbi is nicht shadel the erste Deya, that Rabbi is not rejecting Rabbi Yosef Rabbi, nor kommt Moshe Zainafer, but he's adding, yes, you're right, that Moshe Rabbeinu wrote down from Bereshis until this point, but there's more. That in addition to the history from Bereshis till now, there were also mitzvahs included in this particular sefer. Okay, let's say that that's true. Still, you still cannot claim that the Mechilta is actually the source that Rashi bases his commentary on, for a very simple reason. Because he's not just combining Rabbi and Rabbi Yosef Rabbi Yasser's opinion, because he doesn't actually say Rabbi's opinion as it is. Because Rabbi didn't only say the mitzvahs in Morah, like Rashi does, but many other mitzvahs that Rashi does not quote. And besides that, look what the Mechilta was commenting on, compare that to what Rashi was commenting on. It would be a real stretch to suggest that Rashi's commentary over here is taken from or built on the opinion of the Mechilta. Because the Mechilta was not explaining the pasuk that Rashi is explaining. Vayichtov Moshe, that Moshe wrote this book. Rather, now the pasuk Vayikach Sefer Abris Vayikra be'oznei ha'am. Rather, the Mechilta is actually quoting the next pasuk or the subsequent pasuk that says Moshe then took that book and read from it to the Jewish people on Zogt. And therefore, the Mechilta asks this question: the Torah is telling us that Moshe is reading from the Sefer to the Jewish people, but it's not telling us from which part of the Sefer he starts reading. There are 3 different opinions. Which part? Das heißt, in Mechilta redt sich nicht wegen der Ksive, was hat Moshe geschrieben in dem Sefer. In other words, the Mechilta is not even asking the question, what did Moshe write into this Sefer, and then give us a 3-way debate what that is. Nur wegen dem, was Moshe hat gelernt von dem Sefer be'oznei ha'am. Instead, the Medrash or the Mechilta is trying to work out what of the book did Moshe read publicly. So if we're discussing what Moshe read, it gives us no insight into what Moshe wrote. Because es kann sein, as in the Ksiva hat Moshe Kelo given Meravi in the Kriya. It's possible that there was more written in the Sefer than what Moshe read out in public. Like the Mechilta points out, Loi Shomanu, we haven't yet got the information, May Heichon, from where in them Sefer, within the book, Korah did he read, which really implies that there's more to the book than what Moshe reads. So if the Mechilta is debating what he read, that has nothing to do with Rashi's explanation of what he wrote. But going back to our original issue, where in the simple understanding of the context of these psukim do we have evidence to what Rashi is telling us, as the Vayichtav Moshe is given mi Bereshis v'ad Matan Torah, that what Moshe wrote over here was from Bereshis until that point in history, and mitzvah shenitztava b'Morah, as well as a handful of mitzvahs that they were given at Morah. Before we get there, let's examine something else that Rashi says just a little later, 2-3 psukim later. Now we're at the pasuk the Mechilta was discussing. The pasuk that says Moshe took the book and he read to the people. Rashi says something that will definitely have us scratching our heads, because it sounds like he's just repeating himself. Rashi comments, what are these words? Sefer Habris. Again he says, Mi Bereshis ve'ad Matan Torah. It's the book that has the history from Bereshis till then. Or mitzvah shenitztava b'Morah, and the mitzvahs in Morah. Okay, why Rashi has to explain that to us? The Tamos Rashi daf do b'chlal zogen apirush of Sefer Habris. Why Rashi has to qualify what the Sefer Habris is? That makes sense. Is moving. Yes, we know earlier that Moshe wrote something, but the Torah didn't tell us that what he wrote was going to be called the Sefer Habris. Now we're getting the information that there is a book called Sefer Habris. We don't know that they're the same book. Rashi has to tell us that. Remember a few psukim earlier when Moshe wrote things down from Bereshis and the mitzvahs of Morah? That's called the Sefer Habris. So let me identify it for you now. That we get why Rashi is telling us this. How he tells us is what doesn't make sense. Got to understand. Why does Rashi here have to repeat the details? Which he has already told us previously when we first heard about Moshe writing something down. That it's the history from Bereshis to Matan Torah, or mitzvah shenitztava b'Morah, and the mitzvahs that were given at Morah. Wouldn't it be easier for Rashi just to say, remember that book that we mentioned a few psukim ago? That's called the Sefer Habris. You see, the Rashbam does this. Sefer Habris, dich sev, what's Sefer Habris? He refers back to the pasuk. The pasuk says in the Maila earlier, Vayichtav Moshe v'goyim, that Moshe wrote. Why is Rashi repeating information we already know? Maybe you would argue the reason Rashi has to spell out all the details for us is because the pasuk is only saying simply that Moshe took the Sefer Habris and read to the people. Similar to what the Mechilta asked, but it hasn't told us what out of the book did he read. To paraphrase the Mechilta that we learned earlier, the Torah hasn't told us from which section of the book did he read. The Rebbe get Rashi sufficient, so maybe that's what Rashi is telling us. As dos was gelernt is given mi Bereshis v'ad Matan Torah, that what he read was the history from Bereshis until that point in time, or mitzvah shenitztava b'Morah, and the mitzvahs instructed at Morah. In other words, dem ganzen Sefer Habris, the entire book. Maybe that's what he wants us to know. That's actually not an explanation of why Rashi gave us these details. One of the rules of Rashi is we pay attention to what the heading that he extracts out of the pasuk for his commentary is, and then we know his intention. So if Rashi's intention was to tell us which part he read, he would have pulled out of the pasuk the section that speaks about Vayikra Moshe. Moshe's reading to the people. On the Heruf Zogan, and in that context he would have said, as Vayikra made mi Bereshis chulei, that the reading was from Bereshis till Matan Torah and the mitzvahs. But the reality is Rashi Sefer Habris. Rashi chose to comment on the word Sefer Habris, which means he's not telling us about the reading, but about what's contained in the book. And Rashi doesn't even leave an etc. which would allude to the fact that there is more to the pasuk. As move on from that, we understand as Rashi is not here to describe for us what Moshe read. nor welchen Sefer the pasuk meint mit Sefer Habris, but rather which book the Torah is referring to when it says Sefer Habris is Hadakut, which takes us back to our original question. If Rashi wants to just describe to us which book this is, that the Sefer Habris is the same book we already heard about earlier, why do you have to tell me again what's inside it? You already told me that earlier. In order to understand that, we need to pay attention to one nuance in Rashi's commentary, which is going to open our eyes to what Rashi is telling us. So let's focus on that one nuance, which is, he says, Vayichtov Moshe. The pasuk tells us Moshe wrote. Says Rashi, what did he write? Mi bereishis vad Matan Torah. He wrote first the historical account until Matan Torah. Ve'kosav, and then he wrote mitzvah shenistava b'morah, the mitzvahs given at Morah. Surely that word "and he wrote" is superfluous. We know that he wrote because Rashi has quoted those two words out of the pasuk that Moshe wrote, so we know that he wrote. Surely it would have been easier just to put a vav and a conjunction. That he wrote from Bereshis to Matan Torah, as well as the mitzvahs in Morah. We would easily understand that all of that is incorporated in what Moshe wrote. Why does Rashi elect to put in an extra word, v'kosav, that kind of splits the two parts of what's in this book? And the reason is because he does want to distinguish between the two parts of what's in this book. The Birba explanation is this. In broad strokes, this entire segment of the Torah, which starts off with a recording, the recounting of the fact that Hashem told Moshe to go up onto Har Sinai, is so this entire segment is debated between the commentators on the Torah. What's the debate? When the parasha is gesagt geworden. When did this all happen? When did all these things of writing the book and building a mizbeach and making a covenant with the Jewish people, when did it occur in the chronology of the story? So Rashi says, as parasha Zaynemer Koid Maser Sadibris, this whole parasha precedes the giving of the Torah. And on the 4th of Sivan, that's when Moshe Rabbeinu was told to ascend the mountain. So all of these details must have happened up until and including the 4th of Sivan. Das heißt, which implies that when did Moshe write down the information we're dealing with over here? On the 4th of Sivan. On andere Sachen and various other things that he had to do, like building a mizbeach, those were instructed and then followed out on the Hey Sivan when Moshe was already on the mountain. Relevant for our conversation is that the writing of this book, the Sefer Habris, happens before Matan Torah. Now, the Das Horamban ve'oid, the Ramban and others like the Even Ezra and the Barbanel, they say the opposite. Is das als vorgekommen noch die Aser Sadibris noch Matan Torah? This Sefer Habris was recorded after the giving of the Torah, which, of course, is a little easier for us to relate to because it's described in Parashas Mishpatim, which is after Matan Torah. So the Machlokas in Dimsman. Now, once you have this debate over the timing, when did this book get written, when the parasha is gesagt geworden, and when this parasha refers to, Sashin and Pirish from the pasuk is going to determine a different take on how we understand the pasuk. That it says Moshe in the section came and he told the Jewish people all the words of Hashem and all of the laws. So, as we've already seen, Kol Divrei Hashem, what did Moshe tell them? In the words Kol Divrei Hashem, Rashi says, well, this is before the Torah is given, so it's the mitzvahs, Pirsha v'Hagbara. He told them the instructions about how they prepare themselves for Matan Torah. And then when it continues, and he gave them all the mitzvahs, that's Dizay mitzvah, Shinitztab b'nei Noach, it's the Sheva mitzvahs, V'Shabbos, V'Kibbut Havayim, U'Porah Aduma, V'Nit Dinim, Shnit Lehem b'Morah. It's various mitzvahs and various laws that were given to them at Morah. Whereas the Ramban and his companions, according to them, when Moshe Rabbeinu comes to the Jewish people and he tells them all the words of Hashem, these are words of Hashem that follow Matan Torah, which is, notice, I spoke to you from the heavens, and therefore don't make any idols. And Kol HaMishpatim, according to their view, is Gans Parashas Mishpatim, the entire legal section of Parashas Mishpatim, which is the bulk of the parasha, bis to the Parasha of Moshe Amar Gomer, till the part where we are now, which is where the Torah recounts the story of how Moshe went up the mountain. So if we have two opinions about when this occurred, and therefore two opinions about what laws were included, we obviously then have two opinions about what the nature of the covenant in this Sefer HaBris would have been. So what's a bris? What's a covenant all about? In Jonah von Bris is zu verstärken der Kische v'chibur zwischen die welche sein sich mishtatev in dem Bris. The objective of a covenant is to strengthen, to bolster the connection and relationship between the two parties who are making the covenant between them. Who are they in our context? Eden mit Torah. It's the Yidden with the Torah who are making a bris. Was durch the Torah, was der Eibishter hat sich gegeben, werden sie verbunden euch mit dem Eibishter. And of course, by having a bond with Torah, which is given from Hashem, we now have a bond with Hashem. So who's the covenant between us and Torah? And by extension, Hashem. If he says moving. Now, depending on when this bris happened, will determine what the details are. As like Rashi, as the bris is given from Rashi's perspective, that this covenant was made before the Torah was given. Is the bris safe on durch die Inyanim was der Eibishter hat gegeben Eden from Matan Torah? Well, then the covenant must relate to and must be forged through those parts of Judaism that were already presented to the Jewish people before the Torah. Aber frati welche können stark an in the verbundene bris, and especially those parts of Torah that will actually make our bond stronger. What would make our bond stronger? As Rashi already told us, the whole point of Bereshis is to contextualize that the Eibishter runs the world and therefore gives us the portion of Eretz Yisrael. But that the fact that the Eibishter runs the world, the fact that the Eibishter gave us Eretz Yisrael will strengthen our connection. Bereshis, where do you read that? Bereshis vad achidash hazeh. Well, we're going to get that information from Bereshis until, of course, the first mitzvah, which is mitzvah's kiddush hachodesh. On the bris is given as hachonah v'akdomet matan Torah says hadibros v'chulei, and therefore, in Rashi's view, the purpose of this bris is to ready us to receive the Torah. Aber das Ramban v'oid, whereas according to the opinion of the Ramban and others, is the bris given bika verbunden mit hadibros v'tzivui, was der hat angesagt noch matan Torah. They've already been given the Torah by the time this covenant happens, and therefore the covenant is to strengthen their commitment to all of Torah and mitzvahs. If he says more, as when the pasuk sagt, "Vayichtov Moshe," so now with that information we can understand that when the pasuk tells us Moshe wrote the ksiva from the Sefer HaBris, which describes Moshe writing, composing this book of the covenant, the Sefer was is verbunden mitten bris. Wie gesagt, weiter in der Parasha, the book that will represent this covenant. According to Rashi, what's written in that book? As hat geschrieben, die Kol divrei Hashem was seinen schon bis demol gesagt geworden zu Eden. Well, what must be included in that book has to be the things that were already told to the Jewish people before the giving of the Torah, which is Dahainu, Mi Bereshis Vad Matan Torah, all the parashas that get the story going, und die mitzvot shenitztava b'mora, and the specific mitzvahs the Jews were given by that time. Was the ksiva is given nicht blois zelib der spetete kriya bi'oznei ha'am, and therefore, in Rashi's view, this information isn't only recorded in the book so that Moshe could read it to the people later. Writing the book is part of the covenant. Because when you write something that you had previously discussed, it becomes stronger. And remember, the purpose of a bris is to strengthen the relationship. It created more responsibility and more connection between the Jewish people and these things. So if we have a verbal commitment and then we write it down, it's much more consolidated once you've written it down, and that's exactly what is happening at this point. So Rashi and the Ramban have different views of what is contained in this book, and of course the purpose. Prepare them for Matan Torah or consolidate what just happened at Matan Torah. Because of that distinction, they're also going to have different views about how the information was recorded in the book. Now we can pay attention to why Rashi inserted that word v'kosav, essentially to distinguish between what was written in the book as history from Bereshis until now and what was written in the book as mitzvahs. Why is there a v'kosav? Why is there a mechitza wedged in between? Is because Rashi wants us to know how the information was written in the same book is different when it's the information of the history versus the information of the mitzvahs. So from Bereshis until that point where the book is essentially describing the events that happened to the Jewish people from Bria Soidem Business Man from Matan Torah, from creation until where they're standing. I'd say Rav Ruba Moshe da fashibim besignon uvetzurav is zayin kesuvim b'Torah lefanenu. That Moshe would have written in the style and the writing style and the visual appearance of how things are for us in the Torah. The mechatesi on favos zolem eshane zayin, because why would he do so differently? Or could the mashma k'tzas from Lashon Rashi kufa mi bereishis vad matan Torah, as Rashi is kind of alluding to by saying from Bereishis, like a sefer Torah that goes from Bereishis. So therefore, that information would have been written within the same legal structure as writing a sefer Torah. Whereas, because of mitzvahs shenitztava b'mora, he also wrote the mitzvahs that they had been instructed at that point. Which are just a small collection of mitzvahs, very specific mitzvahs, as listed over here. So, for example, one of those mitzvahs is Parah Aduma. Moshe could not have written it in the style of how it's going to appear later in the Torah, which is Zois Chukas HaTorah. This is the instruction about Torah. Torah hasn't been given yet. And you should give the Parah Aduma to Elazar. Elazar doesn't have a role yet. V'oid, etc. So it's only logical that when Moshe would record these specific mitzvahs, he wouldn't use the kind of language that we're used to seeing in the Torah, als parshias shel Torah, as if it's segments of the Torah. Rather, he'd be just communicating the relevant details of how you do the mitzvah in the now. And the Rashi emphasizes that by saying Rashi v'kosav mitzvahs. He says they wrote mitzvahs, not like he says in other places where he wrote parashiyos shel Torah. Doesn't even get the ksivas parashiyos shel Torah? No, I get it from ksivas mitzvahs. It's very clear. The first segment of the Sefer HaBris, which is the Mu'urah, is the events that happen, is written as parashiyos of Torah in the style of an actual Sefer Torah. These mitzvahs are written in the style of an instruction book for now, not parashiyos shel Torah. Und an der Zeh ist Unterschied zieht, der Weichte Moshe ist gewähnt vor Matan Torah, oder wie der ist, als sie ist gewähnt lachar Matan Torah. You'd see a similar distinction in the style of how the book is written if you go with the view that the book is written before or after the giving of the Torah. Why? Because if name Matan Torah seinen gewähnt tzvei inyanim, before the Torah was given, there were two distinct elements of serving Hashem. Parashiyos HaTorah, there were certain things that were recorded as Torah language, or mitzvah shenitztava b'morah, that's the events of history, and then there were the mitzvahs that were given at Morah. So they're two different things. We know that Bereshis, until Parshas Yisro, as it was then, is as it is in our Sefer Torah now. And we know that the mitzvahs that were given at Morah, as they were then, is not how it is in our Sefer Torah now, and therefore they're written in different styles in the Sefer HaBris that Moshe is producing. Ksivas Parshiyos HaTorah and Ksivas Mitzvahs Shenitztava b'Morah. So the one is in the category of writing columns of Torah, and the other is in the category of writing an instruction manual, which is actually temporary. Nitvis is from Parshas HaTorah, not yet incorporated into the Parshas of the Torah, because there are other details that are still going to emerge. Most notably, that these are mitzvahs of the Torah, as opposed to mitzvahs given to the Jewish people at a particular point in time. Whereas Nochman Torah is talking to machen achilek. Whereas if you go with the Ramban's view that this book, the Sefer HaBris, is written after the Torah is given, there's no reason for a stylistic difference between which part of the information is written in this book. No, the entire book would be written in the same style and the same visual appearance. In other words, according to the Ramban, if Moshe Rabbeinu is now writing down all the mitzvahs of Parashas Mishpatim, he's writing them as a parasha, a legitimate part of Torah. Welche enthalten die mitzvahs, parashas of Torah that incorporate details of mitzvahs, as opposed to just simply independently details of mitzvahs. Damit wird verständigt der Tam, was kommt zum Pasuk Vayikach Sefer HaBris. And now we understand why, when it comes to the point where the Torah describes that Moshe now takes this Sefer HaBris, Rashi appears to repeat himself. Darf Rashi before saying what the Sefer HaBris is, Rashi has to explain exactly what is incorporated in this Sefer HaBris. Hey guys, wir haben gelernt früher, als Moshe geschrieben, zwei Basen drei Inyanim und zwei verschiedene Gidrei Ksiva. Now that we know from Vayichtov Moshe that Moshe wrote down two different types of information, one more historical and one more instructive, in two different styles, one written as genuine parashas of Torah and the other written as the how-to guide for what you got to do as Jews right now. So we know that information. Now we get to this point where we hear that there is a single Sefer HaBris. We need to know which of the two sets of information is in that book, because you don't expect them to be in the same book. They're written differently with a different purpose. Says Rashi, surprisingly, this singular Sefer HaBris incorporates two very different bodies of work. Which is like genuine parts of the Torah, or mitzvahs shenitztava b'mora, as well as the mitzvahs in Mora, which are in a different style. Which helps us to appreciate that the covenant made with the Jewish people at that time spoke to both areas of Judaism. There was a covenant made between the Jews and their commitment to learning Torah. That is, where do you find that information? From the fact that Bereshis till Matan Torah, which is exactly unchanged now as it was then. So that tells us that there's a covenant about learning Torah alt Torah. Then Beis Kima Mitzvahs, there is an independent covenant over here, or a second covenant over here, made between the Jewish people and the commitment to mitzvahs, and that is represented by Durksivas HaMitzvahs Shenitztava B'Mora, by writing down in this Sefer HaBris, the book that represents the covenant, also their commitment to the mitzvahs that were relevant to them at that time. Which helps us to have a clarity. What was the response after Moshe Rabbeinu read this to the Jewish people? As we well know, they gave a double response. We will do whatever we're told, and we'll listen or learn what we have been taught. Nase is their response to the mitzvahs shenitztava b'mora. They had now been given mitzvahs, so they said, we're going to do those mitzvahs. You've just read those mitzvahs to us, we're going to do them. And then, having heard the parts of Torah that are not instructive, but are Torah for Torah's sake, they say, Nishma, we're going to learn that, we're going to hear it. Das ist given der Achana V'Akdama zu limit der Torah HaMitzvahs, was ihnen haben sich mekabel given mikan ulahaba, and that prepared them and paved the way to be able to now commit to the Torah that was still to come, which of course is how we normally understand Nasa v'Nishma, a commitment to the future. But now we have a depth to that understanding. What's their commitment to the future? It's actually based on their attitude to the now. We're now going to do the mitzvahs we were already told. Then you can give us the Torah and we'll do the mitzvahs we're going to be told next. And therefore, certainly from Rashi's perspective, now that they have made this double commitment to the Torah, they are ripe and ready to receive and to follow what the Torah has to say. Now, Rashi often offers us brilliant insights into other areas of Torah. We're going to see the same thing over here in an interesting debate about how the Torah was actually written. Debate in Gemara Gittin between Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish. From the Yonim Ufloim Shepirish Rashi is there, one of the amazing insights Rashi provides. In Gemara is the Machlekes between Rabbi Yochanan and Rabbi Reish Lakish. Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish debate in Gemara Gittin. See, Torah Megillah Nitna. Was the Torah given, in other words, written down, recorded in segments? So like little scrolls of parchment as each piece of information emerged. Rashi explains, as information was given to Moshe, so he immediately recorded it. And then at the end of 40 years in the desert, Moshe Rabbeinu took all of these independent parchments and sewed them all together into the very first Sefer Torah. One possibility. The other possibility is Torah Chasuma Nitna, that the first time that there was a Torah scroll, it was written from Bereshis until Leine Kol Yisrael in one shot. In other words, again, as Rashi says, the Torah was never written down until after 40 years, when all of the information had already been shared. All the information that was given to Moshe the first, second year, etc., of their stay in the Midbar, were all things that Moshe Rabbeinu knew by heart until he eventually wrote them down. Okay, so those are the two views. Moshe downloads information step by step and eventually combines it, or Moshe loads all the information in one Sefer Torah at the end. So Tosfos has a question. That opinion that holds that the entire Torah had to be complete before it could be written. On fact, ask Tosfos. Tema. How could you suggest that that's how the Torah was produced? The Chsiv, it says clearly in our parasha, Vayikach Sefer HaBris, that Moshe Rabbeinu took a written version of the Torah, the Sefer HaBris, which was only part of the Torah, Vayikra be'oznei ha'am, and he read it out to the people, Pirish Rashi v'Pirish Chumash, and Rashi on his commentary on the Chumash said, Dahainu mi Bereishis v'ad that included from Bereishis to Parshas Yisro. In other words, part of the Torah had been written down. How could you suggest Torah Chasuma Nitna? Answers Tosis and Fanfed. When here the Farish, it would seem to be as follows. When it says that the way the Torah was written is all of the information was collected and then written down in one shot, it doesn't mean that nothing was written until the end. What it means is this. The Torah was written in chronological order. There are certain parashiyos that were said earlier but recorded later in the Torah. And therefore, the Torah Chasuma Nitna, according to the perspective of Tosfos, means not that the whole Torah had to wait till the end. It means if there's a parasha that was already available, it couldn't be written until an earlier parasha had been given to be written as well. So the Maharal is Masber. And then with that information, let's have a look at what the Maharal says on our Rashi over here. As Pirish Rashi, but Pasha Seinu is Neit Bistiritz and Mandama Torah Chasuma Nitno. That Rashi over here saying that there is a Sefer HaBris that includes written work of Bereshis until Parshas Yisro, already in full Torah style, does not contradict the view that the Torah was written in one shot. It's not even a contradiction between Rashi's own opinion in the Gemara that the whole Torah was written at the end of 40 years. Why? Das is given a totally different explanation to Tosfos. He says this Sefer HaBris was never intended to become a Torah. It was for instruction purposes. So therefore, this is not yet considered the writing or the giving of Torah. This is considered a book for the purpose of a covenant. Knowing that, it helps us enrich our perspective of Rashi. From is given by from Parashiyos Torah. Yes, it's true that Rashi's view is clear that the style and the presentation of how the parts from Bereshis till Yisro were recorded in the Sefer HaBris is identical to a Sefer Torah. So it still would not be considered that these sections are in fact parashiyos of a future Sefer Torah, nor a tale from Sefer HaBris. Rather, these are pieces of a book of a covenant, albeit they're written in a way that matches how Torah is written. And this particular Sefer HaBris did not only include that information which is ready to go in a Sefer Torah, but even mitzvahs that are in their current form, not the final product as we would put it in a Sefer Torah, the mitzvah shenitztavu be'mora. Und der Schreiben ist auch in ganzen anders von der Ksive Parshas HaTorah, und die beide Suge Ksive haben doch zusammengestellt ein Sefer HaBris. So you have two completely different styles. You have from Bereshis until Yisro, which is written like a full Sefer Torah, and you have the section of mitzvahs be'mora, which is written nothing like a Sefer Torah, and they're both put together into a single Sefer HaBris. Why? Because as the Maharal said, the goal of this book was not to eventually become a Sefer Torah. The goal of this was to be a specific set of instructions for them at that point in time. And also Tosfos fragt von dem Pirish Rashi. What about Tosfos' question? Tosfos was saying, how could there be an opinion that says that Torah Chasuma Nitna if Rashi says it's already Sefer HaBris? Perhaps we could answer it as follows. Because we already have identified that the type of language and the type of presentation of these parashas would be exactly like in a Sefer Torah. Yes, when Moshe produces this Sefer HaBris, it's not only those parashas, but also the mitzvahs that are relevant in Morah, which, as we have made abundantly clear, are not written in the style of a Sefer Torah. Is das aber nicht mevatel oder gerer von dem, was die Parashas mit Bereshis und Matan Torah seien an ihnen von Ksivas Parashas HaTorah, says Tosfos, we are not going to undermine the fact that the first part of the Sefer HaBris is written like Parashas of Torah just because there's an addendum that is not written like Parashas of Torah. And therefore, Tosfos did have his question, we thought you're not supposed to write Parashas of Torah until you're ready to write the entire Torah. And then, of course, he gives his response. But from the Rashi, that would also help us appreciate why it is that Tosfos, when quoting Rashi, specifically quotes these words, Mi Bereshis ve'ad kan, that he wrote into the Sefer HaBris from Bereshis till here. And Tosfos ignores the fact that Rashi also includes that in the Sefer HaBris with the mitzvahs of Mora, because that part is not relevant to his question. The nature of those mitzvahs from Mora that are also recorded in the Sefer HaBris has no bearing on Tosfos' question and answer about how you could potentially have parts of the Torah written like a Torah already before the whole thing is ready. The kasha is not from Ksivas Bereshis and Matan Torah, was ageda from Ksivas Parshas Shel Torah. The only part that Tosfos has a question about is the part that looks like and is written in the style of the Torah. Okay, what's relevant to us? Das Rashi is aber, Rashi's opinion. Rashi is very comfortable with the fact that you have two different styles of writing incorporated into a single parchment, a single sefer. So therefore, because it's a single sefer, it doesn't matter that the first part, Bereshis till Yisro, is written like a sefer Torah. It's not considered a sefer Torah, nor an inyan from Sefer HaBris. It is a different book, like the Maharal points out. It is a book that is specific to the covenant, and it has no issue against the view that you can't write the whole sefer Torah until the end of the 40 years when everything is ready to go. Now, all of this is going to give us a beautiful insight into what's changed now that the Torah has been given, but also what was special before the Torah was given. So the wine, the richness of Torah is this. Is the We've already said that what is a bris? It's to strengthen the bond between the two people participating in the bris. In our case, that's the strengthening the connection between us and Hashem. Is aber da Chelek in dem Teichen HaBris, the bris is gemacht worden lifnei Matan Torah oder achrei Matan Torah. The nature of what that covenant between us and Hashem would be is totally different if the covenant happened before or after Matan Torah. Why is that? Because we know very well that bis Matan Torah is given the gzeira az elyonim leyodim letachtonim vetachtonim lo yalu leyonim. We know that there was a Berlin Wall between heaven and earth before the Torah was given. Kommt aus. Als der Bris von Matan Torah ist noch halt given verbunden mit der Gavra und nicht mit dem Chefze. So therefore we understand that before the Torah was given, if there's a covenant between Hashem and us, that's exactly what it is. It's a covenant between Hashem and us. There's nothing about the materials involved, the Torah, what the Torah affects, the physical world. None of that is affected by this covenant. We say Remizai. Es hat sich tak aufgetan durch Torah mitzvahs, die lifnei Matan Torah, an Aliyah und Achibur mitten im Eibischen. So we can grant the fact that before the Torah was given, those who performed mitzvahs, those who studied Torah, were elevated. The items they did the mitzvahs with, no impact, because there's this iron curtain between the high and the low realms. But the person was elevated, that's for sure. But the extent of that elevation was still constrained by the reality that it's before Matan Torah, which means the person was unable to escape the reality of being a human being even while they were connected to Torah and growing and elevating through Torah. Whereas the Ramban and Co., who say that this covenant happened after the giving of the Torah, that's a totally different story in three ways. Because it's not an aleph bittul hagazera. The first thing is the iron curtain is gone. So there's no barrier to harmonizing the heaven and earth. Then there's the Eibush who took the first step of connecting us. That means that we're empowered. The Yisraelim say not only did the Eibush take the first step, but he invested completely in the experience. The Chiddush from Anon, Nafshi Kisavis Yehavis, we know that the first word of the Aseres HaDibros tells us that the Eibishter literally wrote himself into the Torah, which means the Eibishter hat sich allein kvayochel reingegeben in the Netzach v'tomid in Torah, that the Eibishter completely, so to speak, invested himself and made himself accessible to us forever through Torah. That's not available before Matan Torah. Sich moven. As die Sachtes mit Torah beifen Shabris, hat gepelt Tachlis so Schleimes so Aliyah b'fchines Yitzir Gamre von Geder Nivra. So there's no question about it. After the Torah was given, the nature and the impact of the covenant between us and Hashem is such that it allows us to completely escape ourselves, to transcend ourselves, to connect to the Eibush in a way that is beyond what humans or any created being should be able to achieve. Still, as powerful and great as that is, there was something precious about the covenant as Rashi describes it before the Torah was given. So in the day of Das Rashi, as the bris is given far matan Torah. There's an advantage to Rashi's perspective. Hey, before the Torah was given, as the expression goes in the Mechilta, the Yidden were so bound with Hashem already. They were kshurim, manuvim, tfusim, completely bound up with Hashem. To the extent that Torah was accessible, to the extent that humans could. So they could connect to the Torah that was available, to the Elikus that was available. Is moving. That added tremendous value to the connection that would happen after the Torah was given. Why? Because it's our investment. And there's something beautiful about that. So before the Eibusha said, Vani amaschil, I'm going to put my investment or my infinite nature into this Torah, we worked on ourselves. We tried our best. And therefore, the Yidden at that time, relative to what they were capable of achieving, they created the opportunity for themselves to be ready to receive the Eibusha's Torah, which is completely beyond the reality of the created world. Whereas if you go with the Ramban and others, as the priest is given lachem Torah, that the covenant only occurred after the Torah was given, is b'shas matan Torah given l'mayla the gamer from madigos v'inyonim. Then that means that before, even at the time of the giving of the Torah, Torah was completely beyond them. They were not ready for it. And then as soon as the Torah is given mitzad l'mayla, and the giving of the Torah was the Eibusha's doing alone. Rashi wants to say, no, there's more than that. We actually grew to the ceiling of our opportunities and made ourselves ready to receive the Torah, and that's beautiful. With that information, now we understand why Rashi says what was written into the Sefer HaBris was two different topics, written in two different ways, because what you had over there is Torah and mitzvahs. Whereas the Ramban and others say what's written into the Sefer HaBris is one continuum, one message, one theme. Because Mitzad Gedan Ivroim, Rashi is describing before the Torah was given, where the entire approach and connection to Hashem is based on the created reality, our reality. Hetzach is chalkos from Torah and mitzvahs. In our reality, we definitely see the distinction between Torah, which is about learning, and mitzvahs, which is about practice. That's why our response is Naseh. There's a way we relate to what we're supposed to do, and there's a way we relate to Nishma, what we're supposed to learn. But if you're looking from the Eibusha's perspective, which is reflected in what happens after the Torah is given, you cannot see any distinctions. Just like the Eibusha is absolute oneness. That absolute oneness is going to reflect in Torah. Whether it's Torah, whether it's mitzvahs, makes no difference. It's one inyan of Torah. So what do we see? This progression. Before the giving of the Torah, we did the best to our capabilities. Then the Eibusha gave us a Torah which introduces an infinite capacity to it. Mitzvah Hashem, in the same way, we should be able to show that we have done to the best of our abilities in preparing for the Eibusha to reveal Torah Chadasha, the even more of the infinite capacity of what the Eibusha has to reveal with the coming of Mashiach now.